Michigan. 10 days after a snowstorm, a hunter was moving through a remote area in Livingston County when he tripped over something buried in the snow. It wasn't a branch. Police were immediately called. Beneath the snow, they found the body of a young woman who had been missing for 10 days, 19-year-old Christina Castiglione. At first, it appeared to be a single homicide, but investigators began to notice similarities to an earlier case. 1 year before, a couple's black Labrador had discovered the body of 16-year-old Kimberly Louiselle in a wooded area of the same county. Both victims had been strangled. Both were confirmed to have accepted a ride from a man before disappearing, and both had been left far from where they were last seen. For years, there was no suspect and no way to prove the cases were connected. Could this really be just a coincidence? 2 deaths, 1 year apart, 2 young women, discarded in the same place and in the same way. Over time, these deaths became nothing more than cold numbers in old files. But now, a new clue had surfaced, something that could finally bring the killer into the light. To this day, more than 19,000 homicides in Michigan remain unsolved. That number alone places the state among the highest in the country. But numbers don't tell the full story, because behind them is a system that struggled for decades to keep up. Between 1980 and 2019, cases continued to pile up, across counties, across years, many of them quietly slipping into what investigators call cold cases. By 2022, the homicide clearance rate in Michigan had dropped to around 54%, lower than the national average, which means nearly half of all cases remained unsolved. But this wasn't new. In southeastern Michigan in the 1980s, a troubling pattern was already emerging. Young women were going missing from the Detroit area. Days or weeks later, their bodies would be discovered in remote parts of Livingston County, often miles from where they were last seen. There was no DNA technology to rely on, no advanced forensic tools, and no clear suspect to pursue. That uncertainty would persist for more than 4 decades. The cases of Christina Castiglione and Kimberly Louiselle would go on to trouble investigators and cold case followers for decades. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The victims, the locations, even the circumstances, they all pointed in the same direction. And yet, for years, no one could be held accountable. No suspect, no charges, no answers. It became the kind of case that lingers, one that refuses to disappear no matter how much time passes. That's why we decided to take a closer look. But before we go any deeper into the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, so we can see just how far this case reaches. One of those cases would begin with a 19-year-old woman named Christina Lynn Castiglione. Known as Chrissy to those close to her, she lived in Redford, Michigan, with her parents, Christopher and Beatrice, and her sister, Anna. By all accounts, she was remarkably self-reliant, someone who could manage the girls' varsity basketball and volleyball teams at Redford Union High School just as easily as she could work on a car engine herself. In 1982, she graduated from high school and soon found a clerical position at the Detroit Edison Company. It was a steady job, one she had held for only a few months by the spring of 1983. But even with that stability, Chrissy wasn't someone who imagined her life staying in one place for long. She often talked about leaving Michigan, considering a future in the United States Army as a way to see more of the world. At 19, she was just beginning to figure out what that future might look like. When, on the night of Saturday, March 19, 1983, everything changed. Chrissy had the day off from her job, and she spent the daylight hours with her 25-year-old boyfriend, Christopher Lindsay, a resident of Northwest Detroit. Together, they navigated the typical Saturday routine, running errands for Chrissy's mother before parting ways in the afternoon with plans to meet again later that evening. Chrissy arrived back at her parents' home around 2 p.m. and, feeling the fatigue of the day, lay down for a short nap. By 7:30 p.m., the evening was well underway, but Chrissy had still not heard from Christopher. In an era before the instant connectivity of cellular phones, silence meant uncertainty. Recently, financial constraints had forced Chrissy to sell her Mustang because she could no longer afford the car insurance, leaving her without her own transportation. Driven by a restless need to find Christopher, she decided to set out on foot into the cold Michigan night. Her first stop was just across the street from her parents' house at the home of Christopher's sister. When she found that he was not there, she continued her journey, walking approximately 1 mile down the road to the home of a friend. The two young women sat together for a time, watching television while Chrissy waited, hoping that Christopher would either call or arrive. As the hour grew later and he failed to appear, Chrissy decided she would simply head back home for the night. A short time later, Christopher Lindsay was traveling down 5 Mile Road with a group of friends heading toward a party. As they passed the Kingsborough party store, he spotted a familiar figure standing outside. It was Chrissy. She was heavily bundled against the biting cold and a light, steady drizzle that had begun to fall. She wore a burgundy jacket with the hood of her gray sweater pulled up over her head. Christopher recognized her instantly but did not ask his friends to stop the car. He was acutely aware that Chrissy disapproved of the company he was keeping that night, and he assumed they would simply encounter her again as she continued her walk. He planned to stop at another party store further down the road to purchase beer and wait for her to catch up. When time passed and Chrissy never appeared on the sidewalk, a sense of unease began to settle over Christopher. He eventually decided to walk back in the direction where he had last seen her, searching the length of 5 Mile Road, but the sidewalk was empty. Later that night, he placed several phone calls to the Castiglione household, hoping to hear her voice, but she had not arrived home. Though his concern was mounting, he chose not to share his fears with her parents, wishing to avoid causing them unnecessary worry. He went to sleep with the hope that he would reach her the following morning, unaware that the window of time to find her had already begun to close. The following morning, the silence remained, and the initial concern in the Castiglione household deepened into a sharp, undeniable fear. At approximately noon on Sunday, March 20th, Beatrice Castiglione went to the Redford Police Department to officially report her 19-year-old daughter missing. As the afternoon faded into evening, a chilling lead surfaced. Around 7 p.m., reports began to reach the police from individuals who had witnessed a disturbing scene along Inkster Road. They described a young woman, only partially clothed, being forcibly pushed or handled inside a vehicle that was then driven away at high speed. Believing this could be Chrissy, officers scrambled to the area, their patrol cars weaving through the local streets in a desperate search, but the vehicle and the woman had vanished without a trace. In the midst of the escalating search, a family friend who claimed psychic abilities approached the authorities with a specific and grim premonition. This individual insisted that Chrissy's body would be found discarded in a dumpster somewhere within the city of Inkster. Although the police did not typically rely on such unconventional sources, the lack of other concrete leads drove them to take the tip seriously. For several days, officers meticulously searched every trash receptacle and industrial dumpster they could locate within the city limits of Inkster, but their efforts yielded nothing. The search continued for 10 agonizing days until March 29, 1983. It led investigators to the Oak Grove State Game Area in Livingston County, a remote rural landscape far removed from the suburban streets of the Detroit metropolitan area. That morning, a man named Ronald Latila was walking through the area when something in the open field caught his attention. He stopped at a distance and contacted authorities. When officers arrived, they quickly connected the discovery to the recent missing person report. Based on the physical description and identifying characteristics provided by the family, the victim was confirmed to be 19-year-old Christina Castiglione. The discovery confirmed the family's worst fears. Chrissy's body was found nude, partially covered by the remnants of a snowstorm that had passed through the area days earlier. The cold conditions had preserved critical evidence at the scene. An autopsy later determined that the cause of death was strangulation and confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. Investigators also concluded that she had not been killed at the location where her body was found. Instead, she had been murdered elsewhere, and her body had been transported and left in the field before the snowfall. Attention soon turned to Ronald Latila, the man who had discovered the body. He stated that he had been in the area searching for a location suitable for hunting and fishing. He explained that he had been walking through the field when he noticed the body from a distance and chose not to approach it. From the outset, investigators treated Latila's account with caution. At the scene, officers observed that he did not have any hunting or fishing equipment with him. Further inquiries revealed that a member of his family owned property near the area where Chrissy had last been seen alive. Latila later agreed to take a polygraph examination, but did not appear for the scheduled test. Despite these concerns, investigators were unable to establish a direct link between Latila and the crime. He had no prior criminal record, and no physical evidence connected him to the murder. Without sufficient grounds for an arrest, he was released from suspicion, though questions surrounding his presence that morning were never fully resolved. The investigation into Chrissy's death was a massive, collaborative effort between the Redford Township and Livingston County Police Departments. Within the first 5 months of the discovery at Oak Grove, they pursued more than 80 separate leads and brought in over 20 suspects for questioning. Christopher Lindsay and several of Chrissy's friends were among those scrutinized, collectively undergoing 20 to 25 polygraph examinations. They all passed, and many provided solid alibis that eventually cleared them of any involvement. Despite the intensity of the search for the killer, the trail consistently looped back to the same dead ends. The grim reality of the Oak Grove State Game Area was part of a larger, more disturbing pattern in the region. Between 1978 and 1983, the rural landscape of Livingston County had become a silent witness to a series of horrors. 10 bodies had been discovered discarded on state-owned land during that 5-year span. Each victim was believed to have been murdered elsewhere in the metro Detroit area before being transported to the countryside and abandoned. The isolated, rural nature of the county seemingly offered a sense of security to those who viewed human life as something to be discarded. As investigators dug deeper into Chrissy's case, one conclusion became increasingly clear. She had not been the first. The similarities were too strong to ignore. Because the bodies had all been discovered within Livingston County, local investigators began re-examining earlier cases in an effort to connect them. In doing so, they identified a strikingly similar case from the year before. To understand what happened to Chrissy, they would have to go back 1 year. In March of 1982, 16-year-old Kimberly Sue Louiselle disappeared under circumstances that would later draw striking parallels to Chrissy's case. She was the third of 4 children, growing up alongside her sisters Catherine and Cindy and her brother Timothy. Born in Elkhart, Indiana, she moved to Michigan as an infant when her family relocated north in search of a new start. After moving to Michigan, her family eventually settled in the small community of South Lyon. At the time, South Lyon was home to only about 5,000 people, a place where everyone seemed to know one another and life moved at a slower pace. Kim, as she was known to everyone, was a vibrant and energetic presence. She was a strong-willed girl who possessed a deep, abiding love for horses. Among her peers, she was genuinely liked. She moved through her teenage years with a large circle of friends and a reputation for having no enemies. Unlike many teenagers of the era, Kim avoided the party scene. She did not drink or use drugs, focusing instead on her aspirations for the future. She dreamed of one day becoming a nurse, a career that suited her energetic spirit. At 15 and 16, her world revolved around the typical interests of adolescence, spending time with her friends and navigating the complexities of a relationship with her boyfriend. On the morning of March 18, 1982, Kim and her younger sister Cindy left their home to head to school. Kim was a 10th grade student at South Lyon High School, while Cindy attended the nearby middle school. However, the day took an unexpected turn almost immediately. Before she could even reach her first class, Kim was suspended. By 9 a.m., she found herself outside the high school with the entire day ahead of her. She walked over to the middle school to find Cindy, hoping to persuade her younger sister to play hooky. Kim wanted them to skip school together and travel to visit Kim's boyfriend, Bob, but Cindy declined. The sisters had recently had a serious discussion with their parents, promising them that they would stop skipping school and focus on their education. While Cindy felt the weight of that promise, Kim's strong-willed nature took over. She had no intention of going home to sit in suspension, and since she had no driver's license or car of her own, she decided her only option was to hitchhike. Her destination was Redford, a community about 30 miles away from South Lyon. It was there that her boyfriend, Bob, was living with his cousins. Kim and Bob had met when he lived near her in South Lyon, but after his family was evicted from their home, they had moved in with relatives. The relationship was a source of significant tension within the Louiselle household. Kim was only 15 when they met, while Bob was 18 or 19. Her parents, William and Joanna, disapproved of the age gap, viewing the maturity difference between a young teenager and a legal adult as a major concern. They were also deeply uncomfortable with Kim's habit of hitchhiking to see him, fearing for her safety on the open road. Though they tried to prevent the relationship, Kim's independence often won out. While she had a history of staying away for a few days at a time, she was always careful to let someone know where she was. This time, only Cindy knew her whereabouts, a secret the younger sister would keep until the following day. Kim arrived in Redford and spent the next few days at the house of Bob's cousins. However, the visit did not go as she had hoped. On March 20th, the relationship came to an abrupt end. Bob broke up with Kim, telling her that the distance between South Lyon and Redford was too great to overcome and that he had begun seeing an ex-girlfriend. After delivering the news, Bob borrowed his cousin's car to go to work, leaving a heartbroken Kim stranded at the house. Desperate to get home, Kim prepared to hitchhike once again. Bob's cousin called Kim's parents, promising them that he would personally ensure she got home safely, but it was a promise he would not keep. Instead, Kim walked toward 6 Mile Road. Bob's younger brother accompanied her, feeling a sense of unease about her traveling alone. He waited with her until a driver in an AMC Gremlin pulled over to offer her a ride. As Kim climbed into the car, Bob's brother took the precaution of writing down the vehicle's license plate number. The driver of the Gremlin would later tell investigators that he only drove Kim about 4 miles before dropping her off at the intersection of 8 Mile Road and Merriman Road. His reasons for leaving her there remained a mystery, and he provided no further details to the authorities. As the day progressed, Kim was spotted by members of her own family who happened to be driving down 8 Mile Road. They saw her walking westbound, seemingly heading toward home. Because they were running late for an appointment and Kim did not appear to be in any distress, they did not stop, unaware that this would be one of the last times she would be seen. Along her journey, Kim stopped at a payphone to try and secure a safe ride. She placed 4 different calls to friends, but only one person answered. She reached her brother, Timothy. She asked him if he could come and pick her up, but Timothy was forced to refuse. He had no gasoline in his car and no money to buy any. He told his sister he couldn't make the trip, a realization that would haunt him for decades to come. With no ride and miles still left to travel, Kim Louiselle stepped back out toward the road, and the line of communication with her family went silent. By the morning of March 21, 1982, the silence from Kim had become an unbearable weight for William and Joanna Louiselle. They went to the police to report their 16-year-old daughter missing, but the official response was one of dismissal. To the officers on duty, Kim's history of skipping school and her recent suspension labeled her a runaway. They saw no reason to organize search parties or consider the possibility of a kidnapping. While her parents argued that Kim always eventually made contact and never stayed away without word, the police remained unmoved. The investigation stalled before it even began, leaving the family to endure the passage of time without professional help. For 3 agonizing weeks, there was no trace of Kim. The spring of 1982 was a cold one in Michigan, with snow still clinging to the ground in shaded areas and temperatures refusing to break the winter chill. As the days bled into weeks, the tension within the family reached a breaking point. Cindy, driven by a desperate need for answers and the thought that her sister might be hiding out with her ex-boyfriend, decided to take matters into her own hands. She and one of Kim's friends managed to track down the address where Bob and his family were now living. They had moved from Redford back to Detroit, and without telling anyone where they were going, the two girls drove into the city. When they arrived at the house in Detroit, Kim was nowhere to be found. Cindy stayed to talk with Bob's family, searching for any scrap of information that might lead to her sister. While they were inside, the situation suddenly escalated. Police officers who had been conducting their own surveillance or following leads related to Bob's family surrounded the house and moved in to question the occupants. In the chaos of the surprise entry, an officer spotted Cindy wearing a specific T-shirt, one that was believed to be the very shirt Kim was wearing on the day she disappeared. The police immediately seized Cindy, questioning her aggressively about the garment and where she had obtained it. Cindy, terrified but firm, managed to de-escalate the situation by explaining that she was Kim's younger sister and had simply borrowed the shirt from Kim's wardrobe before the disappearance. Once her identity was confirmed, the officers moved her to a separate room to keep her out of the way, while they continued their interrogation of Bob and his relatives. As Cindy sat alone in that room, wondering if she was any closer to finding Kim, Bob's sister slipped inside. She told Cindy she needed to come out because the adults were talking about Kim. It was at that moment that William and Joanna Louiselle arrived at the house to collect their daughter. They had been notified by the police of Cindy's location. When Cindy saw them, she asked if they had heard any news. Her parents confirmed that Kim had finally been found. For a fleeting, ecstatic second, Cindy believed the nightmare was over and that her sister was safe. That hope was instantly shattered when her parents spoke again, clarifying that while Kim had been found, she was dead. Kim's body had been discovered earlier that morning, April 14, 1982, in Island Lake State Recreation Area, a state park located only 6 miles from her home in South Lyon. A couple out for a morning walk with their dogs had stumbled upon the scene. Kim was lying in a fetal position, completely naked, approximately 400 feet away from a park and ride lot near the freeway. There was no identification, no clothing, and none of her personal belongings nearby. To this day, those items have never been recovered. The location was tucked away in an area not frequently accessed by the public, though it was familiar to local children who would often crawl through a hole in a nearby fence to swim in a gravel pit during the summer months. Because the area was so obscure, the discovery suggested that whoever had placed her there possessed a specific knowledge of the local landscape. The morning after the discovery, a state trooper returned to the scene to search for further evidence. While he found nothing belonging to Kim, he made a startling and unrelated discovery: more than 50 live explosives and 25 sticks of dynamite. The hazardous materials had been left behind by a group that had conducted seismic geological surveys in the park the previous month. Though a strange and dangerous find, it had no connection to the crime that had ended Kim's life. The authorities determined that Kim had not been killed in the park. Instead, her body had been transported there and placed in the brush after the fact. She was taken to Sparrow Hospital in Lansing for a formal examination. The medical examiner concluded that Kim had been deceased for 4 to 6 days prior to being found. This realization brought a horrific new dimension to the case. If she had only been dead for less than a week, it meant that Kim Louiselle had been held captive, alive, for approximately 2 weeks after her disappearance on March 20th. The autopsy revealed the extent of the brutality she had endured during those 14 days. Kim's cause of death was ruled a homicide by strangulation. The examiner noted that she had been repeatedly raped, beaten, and strangled over the course of her captivity. The marks around her neck showed multiple layers of bruising in various stages of healing, proving that her attacker had strangled her near the point of death multiple times before finally delivering the fatal blow. Though the physical evidence of her ordeal was clear, the passage of time and the exposure to the elements meant that very little usable DNA evidence could be recovered from the scene. In 1982, the science of genetic identification was only beginning to gain traction in criminal investigations, and the hope for a breakthrough in Kim's case rested on the small amount of DNA evidence that had been recovered. However, that hope was quickly extinguished. During the critical period of transportation to the laboratory, the samples were mishandled and contaminated, rendering the DNA completely unusable for testing. The failure left the investigation without the forensic anchor it desperately needed, and the trail began to grow cold. As decades passed and DNA technology reached unprecedented levels of sophistication, the possibility of finding answers resurfaced in the mind of Kim's sister, Cindy. She considered the painful step of having Kim's body exhumed, hoping that modern techniques might uncover evidence that had once been out of reach. She reached out to a detective to discuss the option, but the response was cautious. With so little DNA available and so much time having passed, the chances of recovering anything usable were slim. After speaking with her parents, the family made the difficult decision to let Kim rest in peace, choosing not to pursue exhumation. In 2014, cold case detectives in Livingston County revisited the investigation, re-examining old evidence in search of overlooked details or new connections. But even then, no answers came. For decades, both cases remained unresolved. No arrests, no clear suspects, and no justice. There were no major breakthroughs and no public campaigns, but the cases were never truly forgotten. Behind the scenes, the families continued to carry the weight of unanswered questions. They stayed in contact with investigators, followed developments in forensic science, and held on to the hope that one day something might change. Time moved forward. Technology advanced. And slowly the possibility of answers began to return. What had once seemed impossible was now within reach. For nearly 40 years, the Livingston County Cold Case team and detectives worked extensively on the case and pursued an exhaustive number of potential leads. In March of 2022, the office applied for and received grant funding through Season of Justice to conduct advanced DNA testing on the suspect DNA samples taken in 1983. Season of Justice is a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding DNA testing on unsolved cold case homicides. They provide funding to law enforcement agencies nationwide to conduct advanced testing in homicide, sexual assault, and Jane/John Doe cases where the victim's body or the suspect is unidentified, and DNA is the only investigative option. In May 2022, forensic DNA evidence from the case was sent to Othram. Othram scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive genealogical profile from the DNA of the unknown male suspect. Othram's in-house genealogical team used the genealogical profile to produce investigative leads. Othram returned the investigative leads to the Livingston County Cold Case team, who used the leads to continue following up on the Castiglione murder. This process ultimately led to one name: Charles David Shaw. Detectives were unable to find any direct ties between Christina and Charles Shaw to suggest why she was targeted. However, through collaboration with living relatives of the killer, it was determined that he was a long-time Livonia resident who lived less than 5 miles from where Christina went missing. Based on information received from Shaw's family, he was described as a sex addict with a disturbing life who struggled with mental illness and his gender identity. Charles Shaw had several interactions with law enforcement beginning at a young age. Livonia Police Department, burglary in 1973, drug possession in 1977. Then, in 1981, he was arrested and sentenced to 2 weeks in jail and probation for the attempted kidnapping of a woman in a Fowlerville McDonald's parking lot, and in 1982 arrested again for stealing women's shoes at a Kmart. Although the perpetrator was identified, no sentence would ever be carried out. Charles David Shaw had died in November 1983. just 8 months after Christina's murder, in an accidental incident caused by sexual asphyxiation. In June 2023, following the identification of Charles David Shaw in Christina Castiglione's case, investigators turned their attention back to the evidence collected in the 1982 murder of Kimberly Louiselle. Biological material recovered at the time had been preserved for decades, but the technology available in the early 1980s had not been capable of producing a usable profile. With advances in forensic DNA analysis, those same samples were resubmitted for modern testing. Using contemporary methods, scientists were able to develop a viable DNA profile from the evidence. That profile was then entered into CODIS, the combined DNA index system used by law enforcement agencies across the United States to compare DNA profiles in criminal investigations. The result was immediate. The DNA profile developed from Kimberly Louiselle's case matched the same individual who had already been identified through genetic genealogy in Christina Castiglione's murder, Charles David Shaw. This confirmation provided direct forensic linkage between the two cases. What had once been considered separate investigations, connected only by circumstantial similarities, were now tied together by biological evidence. Investigators were able to establish that both victims had been attacked and killed by the same individual. The findings also reinforced earlier suspicions that had existed during the original investigations in the 1980s, when similarities between the cases had been noted but could not be proven. With the DNA evidence now in place, those connections were no longer theoretical. On September 14, 2023, Michigan authorities publicly announced the results of the investigation. Charles David Shaw was identified as the individual responsible for the murders of both Kimberly Louiselle and Christina Castiglione. The announcement brought a complex response. For investigators and the families involved, it provided long-awaited answers and a clear identification of the person responsible. At the same time, the absence of a trial meant that the legal process had come to an end before it could begin. After more than 4 decades, the cases were no longer unsolved. The questions of who had committed the crimes had finally been answered, even if the opportunity for justice had passed. Yet even with those answers, one case remained outside that resolution. Following the official announcement identifying Charles David Shaw as the killer of Kimberly Louiselle and Christina Castiglione, investigators in Oakland County revisited the 1981 murder of 20-year-old Anne Marie Doragazzi to determine whether a connection could be established. Doragazzi's body had been discovered in a ditch near Camp Dearborn in Milford Township. She had last been seen several days earlier at one of the camp's bathhouses, where she both lived and worked. An autopsy determined that she had been strangled. Her clothing had been disturbed, with her shirt pulled over her head and her pants and underwear found nearby. However, investigators found no evidence of sexual assault. The condition of the body raised additional questions. Although it had rained the night before her body was discovered, her remains were dry, suggesting that she had been killed elsewhere and transported to the location. However, key differences complicated the comparison. Investigators found no confirmed evidence of sexual assault. While certain elements, such as the method of killing and the apparent relocation of the body, appeared consistent with the other cases, the forensic evidence told a different story. A single hair not belonging to the victim had been recovered from Doragazzi's body. At the time, however, forensic analysis was limited to basic characteristics such as color and structure. The technology required for DNA sequencing did not yet exist. In later years, investigators revisited that evidence using modern techniques. But unlike the cases of Louiselle and Castiglione, where biological material provided viable nuclear DNA, the hair recovered in Doragazzi's case lacked a root. Without a follicle, it could not yield the type of DNA required for definitive identification or genealogical analysis. While mitochondrial DNA can sometimes be extracted from hair shafts, it is far less specific and cannot be used to identify an individual with certainty. As a result, even with modern advancements, the available evidence has not been sufficient to establish a conclusive link to any suspect. Investigators have acknowledged the similarities, but no direct forensic connection to Charles David Shaw has ever been confirmed. For now, Doraghazi's case remains unresolved, standing at the edge of a pattern that may or may not be fully understood. In the years since these cases were reopened, investigators have acknowledged a broader reality surrounding violent crime in Livingston County during that period. While Christina Castiglione and Kimberly Louiselle's murders have now been resolved, they represent only a small portion of the violent crimes connected to the region in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Records from law enforcement indicate that multiple homicide cases from that era remain unsolved, though no comprehensive public breakdown exists detailing how many occurred specifically in the rural areas where these victims were found. What is clear, however, is that the landscape itself, isolated, wooded, and largely unmonitored at the time, played a recurring role in how these crimes unfolded. Victims were taken elsewhere and left in places where discovery could be delayed and evidence could be lost to time. Despite advances in forensic science, only a fraction of these cases have been resolved. The identification of Charles David Shaw marked a significant breakthrough, but it did not close every question tied to that period. Even now, decades later, some cases remain open, waiting for the same combination of technology, persistence, and circumstance that finally brought answers to two families, but has yet to do the same for others. Some cases found answers, others are still waiting. If this case left you with questions or thoughts of your own, let me know in the comments. These stories are never as simple as they seem, and your perspective matters. And if you want to explore more cases like this, there are other stories waiting. Some solved, some still unanswered. Until next time.